Okay, I think we're live. So I got a hello from Greg already. Hey everyone, welcome to, I guess we'll call this a journal club. It's more of a round table kind of thing to the Perception Action Journal Club. So the idea of this is what we wanted to start doing. I don't know how regularly, but getting together to discuss kind of the ecological approach, some of the things going on, where the challenges we're facing, things we're seeing on kind of a semi-regular basis, because I'm realizing more and more that this is kind of a shared experience where you evolve and adapt your understanding and application of this. I think having kind of thinking about it and discussing it fairly regularly and kind of having some theme through it, I think can be valuable. So let's say hi to everyone. Everyone's been here before, but maybe hi and what's going on with you, Marianne? How are things and what are you up to related to this topic in any way?
Yeah, hi. Oh gosh, lots of things. I'm busy working on the skill app content at the moment at UK Coaching, and obviously playing around with some concepts that you guys, I keep throwing stuff over to you to have a look at. Playing with my trees again as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we were talking about that just before you came on. Yeah. I stole your trees. Yeah.
Lots of, they've developed a little bit more. I'm going to ping you over my latest version.
Okay.
And yeah, and part of it is it's all kind of related, isn't it? It's trying to sort of sense make stuff and find ways to communicate something that doesn't rely on trying to explain something different, but within a language and concepts that are kind of attached to something else. I think that's a lot of the difficulty, isn't it? When we trying to use language to explain something, if the language already has an application in another way of thinking, it sort of drifts in that direction. And interestingly, the other things that are kind of popping up in terms of, and I was going to say playing with this, but it is that, some people talking about how do we encourage, what does this concept of playing mean? And is it just, being like childlike or having a game, or, how do we have sessions where maybe we've got adults who have never been encouraged to play or think that, you're setting them up, or that there is a right way to do something that, as a coach. And the other bit actually is how do we apply an ecological lens to things like fatigue, training to withstand pressure, and resilience and things like that. And I've just been making me reflect on some really interesting stuff from my experience in mountain rescue. And I kind of go, it's just like there's so much in this that's really fascinating from a representative and meaning perspective. Again,
that's cool.
That's what
I know you've been looking at things like self-talk and think aloud and trying to think some of these different ideas and from the ecological perspective. Yeah, I think that's cool stuff.
It differently. What are we paying attention to? What are we pending, aware of, curious about, noticing? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Stu, how are things? What's going on with you?
Good, Rob. We lots of bits and pieces happening. But I guess I've probably spent a bit of time of late, notwithstanding my excellent podcast, which was well received with Casey, who's on tonight. Mm-hmm. But I started to just sort of, I guess, explore a little bit outside of what you might call the traditional sort of skill acquisition ecological realm, having some interesting conversations. Recently just had a conversation with Sky Eddie Bruce from Soccer Parenting Association in the States, just talking about some of the parental dynamics, which are often kind of lost. And actually literally just got off a call with a colleague of yours, Joe Baker, who's got some really, really interesting research emerging about early specialization. And maybe it's not quite the villain of the piece that we perhaps thought it was. So it may well be that we might subject him to a purple peril on the Journal Club in the future, because there's some interesting findings there, I think. So anyway, yeah, that's what I've been just exploring of late. So nice to dive back in and to spend time with this learned group of people, including Marianne, who seems to basically doodle for a living. So
yeah,
tell me your secret, Marianne.
You've got another career. Yeah. Were you doing your own illustrations for your book? When's your book coming out?
Stupidly, that a year and a half ago.
Craig, welcome back. What's new? What's going on with you?
Cheers, Rob. Evening, everyone. Yeah, I'm just marveling at Stu's ability to sound check where he's at and produce a Hollywood-style trailer for his podcast as he does it.
He's a pro. He's a pro.
Incredible work. Yeah, I'm really well, thank you. I guess in the day job, I think we're going through the whole alphabet of plans regarding Tokyo at the moment. In terms of all the emergent complexity around that and planning and connecting with athletes' motivation and situation in terms of where we base ourselves and when. So that's pretty noisy but enriching work. I think we're learning a lot about ourselves through that process, through the adverse conditions we're in. On a personal level, lots of interesting learning. I think I've been back to uni more times in the last 2 weeks to deliver lectures or sit on forums than I have in the last 17 years. So it's been pretty scary, but sat yesterday at a school in Wales. You may have seen it on Twitter, sort of connected around ecological dynamics and just a safe forum for people to engage. So it was a really rich experience yesterday, looking at some of the parallels between the constraints of an education system and a performance sporting system and how that relates to, I guess, pedagogy and how things are experienced from a athlete or participant perspective, which I know will resonate with Stu pretty deeply. And then, a bit of co-creation piece for UKC content. So Mary and I haven't quite got any trees in there, but we've been bashing around a few things, which has been really interesting. Kind of got to this point I was sharing with Carl, who can't be here tonight, but around kind of, for me, co-creation sits in a worldview where it is in and of that worldview and not an intervention tool to be used. It's kind of just deeply rooted in Marion's tree, probably somewhere. And the heavy side of it, Rob, is I'm trying to work my way through the Bickhart case study of Gibson. So I'm halfway through that and brain fried, but energized for the second half after a cup of tea.
Oh, sounds good. Casey, sitting in front of some complicated looking diagrams.
Volleyball. I'm intrigued by those.
No, nothing as grand as these guys. We're just kind of getting going, training here. The NCAA, because of the pandemic, split the season. Our conference ended up splitting our season in half. So we played a little bit in the fall, took a huge break, and are back to competing here in 18 days. The cool thing is we get this kind of rare training block run up to competition that we normally wouldn't have. Normally it'd be pretty compressed and we'd start playing right away. And so some of those concerns that are often raised about, these ecological approaches about timescales and, hey, can we get this development done in time? We get to, those are a little more relaxed, so we can, that stress, it's always there as a coach, but it's right now we can kind of say, hey, we've been at it 2 weeks now, probably 2.5 more. And we can really dig into manipulating some activities and paying attention to behaviors as they emerge and trying to honor the constraints-led approach or ecological dynamics as truly as possible, as opposed to what I would consider cutting corners when you get panicked due to time constraints and stuff like that. But on the other, outside of that, a lot of time spent in the office and in the gym. But outside of that, I think some of these approaches, our sport is behind in our country in respect to these ecological approaches, and we're catching up. I promise we're catching up. We're coming, and we'll get there. But I think what I'm learning is that I'm not skilled enough yet translating it if it needs to be translated for people who aren't familiar with it. And that's kind of a fun challenge. There's some stress there in terms of, man, if I screw this up, then I'm going to disappoint a lot of people on the other side of the pond, so to speak. But that's been fun, and I think some of the things we may talk about today are things that I've run into pretty often in terms of misinterpretation and my inability or ability to kind of sift through that and explain it in a digestible but effective way. And so yeah, that's been a challenge. But there's some cool people over here. Lauren Anderson, who I know a lot of you guys know, has done a wonderful job, and Harjiv Singh has done a really wonderful job of kind of getting this information out there in our sport. So we're on our way, I promise.
Well, that all sounds really good. It sounds to me like we're living up to, not to pat ourselves on the back, but moving forward positively. I think expanding into other areas, this approach usually not used, trying to communicate better. That sounds good to me. But as I mentioned, one of the things I wanted to do, so these, as I mentioned, these are just going to be kind of open discussions. But one of the things kind of hitting on your point, Casey, is I wanted to address some of the misunderstandings and things you see out there. The purpose of this, rather make clear, is not to make fun of anybody or show how dumb they are or ridicule anybody. But I think it's important if someone's going to put something out there, the constraints-led approach is this, it's important, and it's not the way that we see it, consistent with the theory and stuff. I think it's important to point it out and give an alternative view. I think it's important for us to do that. So that's what my motivation is for this, right? So I want to, there's a couple ones you guys have seen. I don't know if it's worth sharing my screen for this. The first one I want to mention is there's I don't know if you've come across, anyone else has come across Raymond Verheyen. Yeah. He's a soccer coach. Right, soccer, right, Sue?
Yep, that's right. Yeah.
He's written a book, and about soccer, and someone else, a couple of people have forwarded this to me, and also he's on a recent podcast talking about this. Let me put up, see if I can share this. I don't know if people will be able to read this. So he's talking about perception. He calls it the perception action model. And from ecological psychology. And his basic point he's making several places is that he sees the perception action model as fitting with individual sports like sprinting for Usain Bolt, but that it doesn't work in team sports. And I've seen him express this a few different ways. And again, my purpose here is I think this is a major misunderstanding. So the reason below, he's showing below. So he's saying the reason it works in team sports is, right, Usain Bolt is he's perceiving a signal to start running, and then he runs, right? The bottom paragraph, he's explaining why he thinks it doesn't work in team sports, because so he's saying if you are a soccer player with the ball, you turn your body left, that makes your teammate drive to the left, right? So you're giving the person so you've influenced the perceptual signal before you've acted, right? So it somehow corrupts this perception action model, right? Because you're not getting this pure perceptual signal, right? I don't know if anyone else would come, but the problem with it is that second paragraph pretty much exactly describes perception action coupling perfectly. I could not, right? That's it. So it's not perception arrow action, right? It's perception. They're coupled they're in both directions, right? I don't know if anyone, Marianne, I could see you.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, well, he also describes a complex adaptive system perfectly there. That is what happens. What we do in a system like that influences what happens around us, influences what we do. And that's why, that's really interesting. I'm just thinking that's a complex system rather than, and his first one is almost a little bit more like, what a motor program was kind of developed for. This is a ballistic, there's a stimulus, there's a response. How do we account for you being able to adapt to it? Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah. So the problem he identifies in the second paragraph is a valid one, but it's exactly the reason Gibson proposed perception action is coupled. Action, we act to perceive, right? As much as we perceive to act. So I don't know if anyone else has So like I said, I just wanted to, so if you read that, just, think about it. I think you can start the first calling it a perception action model. That's not what it's called. So you can kind of know it's going to go a bit downhill from there.
In fairness, Rob, I
Mhm.
I think on some levels it's a great example, and perhaps we're there's a degree of I don't know benefit to the fact that this has been shared, because I can imagine this being a a kind of an understanding that quite a few people might have, which is the assumption that because perception action coupling has to a certain extent, it assumes that we act because of our perception, not the fact that there is this kind of loop. So maybe it should be called like perception action loop. I don't know. I haven't got the right term, but I don't know. I mean, maybe people make an assumption that it is a kind of linear process, and it doesn't. And it's useful to be able to talk about it, because in actual fact, it's the very opposite of that. So on some levels, this may well be a fairly widespread misconception that is useful to unpick. But it does make me wonder whether the term, again here on a terminology, whether there is a better way to articulate this, or maybe it's just a question of getting across what it actually is and what it actually isn't more readily to people. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, no, Stu, that's a great point. I'd like to emphasize that I want to express that I kind of, on one, I think we share the responsibility for the interpretations of these, and these are very common. Some of the other ones we'll talk about are very, very common, and they're very constructive to see how people interpret that. I think you're right. It's not just bashing here. I think it's very instructive to see how people are thinking about these things. That's why I pulled these out. I think so. I agree. Perception. I don't think the coupling doesn't come across what it really is a deep word with a lot of meaning.
Yeah.
Another one. I don't know if you guys. The other word I was talking to Stu McMillan from Altus. We were kind of exchanging the problem with the phrase self-organization. The self in self-organization. I think people think it's still centrally controlled, top down. Right? When you say, I think athletes self-organize their coordination, a lot of people go, yeah, that sounds great to me, because they just do it themselves, right? You take responsibility, you think about how to do it, but you do it yourself instead of me telling you. But self-organization that's not what self-organization, the real term, means. So we were talking something like emergent organization would be much, because it's then you link it to self-regulation, but it's not quite the same. Those things are related, but the true self-organization is like a flock of birds. Like there's no, when you say self-organization, often people still think you mean, oh, my brain still controls everything. But it's just my own, I figure it out myself, not the coach filling my brain. I think but that's not the true sense of the word. So, yeah. So I think you're right, Stu. There's some terminology that I don't know. I saw one on Twitter today to someone talking about the word skill. Also, it was a good point. Players have, when you say an athlete has skills, sometimes they think you're talking about how long they can keep a soccer ball up in the air or do fancy tricks, right? In baseball, we call them tools. How tools is fast. It doesn't mean they can play at all, which what we want to mean by skill. But yeah. Any other comment, Craig?
I'm curious, Rob, around, I have to be careful here because I don't know the intention of the question, but on the session I cited yesterday with the university, or the school, should I say, over in Wales, somebody asked in the chat whether it was easier to engage in ecological dynamics in an individual sport versus a team sport. And I guess that's I'm seeing some potential links here to the screenshot regarding kind of misconceptions around perception and action. And I think I'm curious whether people just get pretty scared around the complexity of interrelating pieces of the jigsaw in terms of the perception coupling relative to multiple affordances and nested affordances and these sort of things. And I think it is when you get into that people can hit a wall maybe and bounce back a little bit at that stage.
Yeah, that's a good point. Casey or Stu, Casey, do you applying it to team sports?
Yeah, I think Stu and I chatted about this a little while back, and our sport that's where you get the most pushback. It's just because as Stu and I discussed, there's not possession. You don't get to hold the ball in volleyball. Everything's a rebound based on the action that occurred before you, and it's so there's no way, per the rules of the game, you need multiple actors. So it's really alluring to want to control that, to be the conductor and explicitly instruct. It is, on the flip side, it's scary to say, hey, we're going to allow these things to try to emerge, especially when, like I was saying before, you're under you're often under time constraints. We got to win next weekend, or so on and so forth. Or it feels like that is the right way to put it. But I think that it's certainly possible. I would argue, obviously, that it's possible. I think it's been certainly beneficial. But a lot of the pushback that I've gotten is related to this idea that in a team sport, especially one where we can't manipulate timing, where we're kind of beholden to timing, then it just is an uncomfortable place to say, hey, we'll just allow these things we'll set up some constrained activities with targeted information, so to speak, and we'll look for emergent behaviors, synergies and stuff like that. And it's just an uncomfortable deal for a lot of people. It's a big leap in our sport, and I think that's one of the reasons why it has been dominated by more cognitive information processing approaches, because our sport, in my opinion, our sport sits on an extreme end of the spectrum, where you have to have multiple actors to play the game. There's no possession in terms of being able to manipulate the ball outside of a rebound. It's certainly a hurdle to overcome, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Great. Like things like we always talk about intrinsic dynamics or coordinated, how you scale those up to a team level can get pretty complicated.
Can I ask a question, guys, about so team sports are not something I've got a lot of experience in, other than playing canoe polo and a bit five-side football. But I was just thinking with that, and this is really relevant, I think, to riding horses and stuff to do with horses. A lot of the time in those environments, when we think about that perception action coupling being moving to perceive, we also move to pick up information about what our movement effects are on the environment. And I do that quite deliberately with a horse. If I do this, then I'll do something, and then it's like a probing activity. When I do this, what happens? And I'm kind of paying attention at various levels, not all of it very explicit, and then I'll do something else and see what happens. And it's a way of me picking up the patterns of how the environment moves in relation to me, that environment being another sentient being, whether that's a horse or somebody I'm playing polo with. And maybe that isn't, that's not sort of as easy to pick up from just going, we move in order to perceive, because we move in order to influence as well. I think it's not just so that we can see differently. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'm making sense there.
No, I think great teams, in a lot of team sports, you move to cause the other team to break down or cause their defensive reaction to create an opportunity. So you're like 2 steps ahead, basically.
Yeah. What happens, what's happening, and then you wait till you see like a disruption in that pattern or that defense, and then take advantage. So there's this constant interplay all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm curious around that, Marianne. You and I have discussed at length with Andrew as well, that sense of tactical planning of a route, be that on a climbing wall or for us on a river. And the parallels then to what we see a lot in football in the UK is the manager preparing a substitute with an iPad that appears to have some sort of kind of set play or I don't know what's on there, Casey. Maybe you could tell me. But yeah, in terms of, I guess, people struggle a little bit. They kind of have a good grasp on some aspects of an ecological approach, Rob. But when you get into this, well, how do we plan tactics as a team? How does set plays, and what does that actually link to how behavior is emerging when it's actually realized in what Andrew would call the law-based domain, I guess?
It's interesting, Rob, because I would have said that for most people, the team sport space where you've got such very obvious dynamics. So the dynamics of information being present from connectivity with teammates, information being present from the dynamics of opponents that we need to attend to and attune to. That is a very naturally very rich information, kind of rich environment that naturally you think, well, obviously, there's others that we collaborate with or contend with as a means by and their action, their movement, their cues, if you like, are relevant source of information that should be an important part of how we discover ways in which we can become more skillful. Their information, and so that's very obvious. But when you don't have that, when it's just you. And particularly in sports like, let's say, golf, where the reality is, so in canoeing, for example, or in riding, there's a lot of information present by the fact that, you've either got surging water or, a lot of different dimensions that are at play in the environment that are still going to be there for you. In riding, like you say, there's a sentient being, but in a game like golf, there's basically just nothingness in reality. However, there is obviously still a load of information present, and so strangely enough, it's very odd that you would draw this conclusion that actually an ecological approach is more at home in a scenario that is essentially robbed of information, like sprinting, because ultimately, if you look at it on a very simplistic level, and I'm not, but if you were, there's basically a bang of a gun and run as fast as you can. There's not much else to it. Obviously there is loads of stuff, but you'd think to yourself, well, hang on a second, if there is ever a space where perception action coupling exists, it's probably less there, and it's going to be more in the space where there's loads of bodies that actually you need to consider. So it's very odd that you would arrive at that conclusion, but it's also probably very instructive, I'd say, because strangely, I found myself thinking, isn't it interesting how someone could arrive at this misperception about perception? Because it definitely isn't how I think most people sort of say to me the opposite. They go, oh yeah, I get it in team sports, but it wouldn't apply in golf, or it wouldn't apply in javelin. And yeah, it still obviously does. It applies in all these different domains in just different ways. So it's a very, I don't know. I just found it really intriguing that you'd arrive at that conclusion. I remember reading it and literally turning my head sideways, like, wow, how'd you get to that point?
Yeah.
I
Sorry, go ahead, Mary.
I know I just put the chat there that I can see how you'd get there if you've just gone really simplistically down one tree that's non-representative and one tree that is, and gone behaviorism sits here, that stimulus response. Possibly.
Yeah. Well, I think that's good. Yeah, I think that's a fair point, though. Team sports is, if anywhere is going to require being adaptive and variable. Teams. I even have it within baseball. I get it that hitting, people buy it because you're reacting. You have to be variable. But pitching, I control everything like a golf swing. So why do I need so much variability, right? So it's even within the sport, I think. So yeah, that's an interesting point too. The other one I wanted to. This was one Mark Sullivan sent us. This article in this one, in case anyone's interested. Jose Mourinho and is it Thomas Tuchel hold opposing ideals on two sides of the same coin. So I don't know I've never read this author before, but I can almost picture them. Oh, somewhere I learned that there's two skill acquisition approaches, one very prescriptive and one where they let people do it on their own. I'm going to put this story into that box, that framework, no matter what. That's almost seems like what they were trying to, or, so basically they're talking about contrasting approaches of being prescriptives and different levels of team play. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to read this. I pulled out a couple quotes. So there's a constraints-led, which is adding parameters but telling them nothing, and asking leading questions. The theory, there's no right or wrong way of doing things as it's adaptable. So apparently Tuchel's practices this. So I think they got some input for some people about what these different, so they talk about differential learning. So the next one, both are practitioners of differential learning, means basically you set a task and let them figure it out, but skillfully. And it's a holistic method and takes in both techniques and tactics. For example, making players practice set pieces with everybody holding tennis balls in both hands so they can't grab shirts. That's actually a constraint, not differential learning, I would point out. But within the numerous examples of constraint-led learning, such as when Tuchel wants players to become more adept at devastating play through the center, funnel-shaped pitches would be set where the narrowest point would be in the 6-yard box, conditioning players to think that way. It followed the idea of Ralph Rangnick, one of his early mentors, to make training more complicated than the game, so matches seem easy. Okay, there's a few things in here, and there's a lot more if you read the whole article. One of them, the first one I want to pick up on is this one. Going back to what you said, Stu, this impression we have to take responsibility for that. Constraints-led approach and ecological approach is just letting people figure it out on their own without telling them anything. That is an enduring thing I keep seeing over and over, that it's completely hands-off coaching. So telling them nothing. Do you guys still see that impression?
I do, I think, but strangely, because I'm not. I don't know. I don't know whether it's entirely a misconception, but or it's just the assumption being that using constraints led and you define the environment in such a way that you then just let people work out on its own is, I think, more a sense of what it feels like or seems like in comparison to the alternative, which is very directive. Mm-hmm. So when you take an instructional approach, which is very much defined by an individual who's saying, you do this here and you do this here, and I'll show you how, and I'll tell you what, and I'll and all those sorts of things, and then you look at an alternative of that, which looks in relative terms to be less interventionist. I think the assumption people draw then is, oh, you're just completely hands off. And it may also be that some people's assumption, and therefore some people who espouse them to be practitioners of, say, a constraints-led approach, actually do act in that way. So, I definitely have heard of lots of people, game is the teacher. So there's your game, and I'm just going to fold my arms and see you again in half an hour type of thing. So I definitely think some people have taken the concept and made it that. So I think there's two dimensions of that. Like, people are misunderstanding, but also people have got another frame of reference that this seems like the opposite of. And I'm not surprised that, this kind of article is written, because it's definitely designed to I see this a lot, which is it's almost being presented as being what's the word? But a bit like voodoo. It's a bit, witchcraft. They're weird over there. Weird, strange things. I see that a lot, and this feels like this could be in that bracket of, presenting things as kind of strange. Particularly when you see, someone like Tuchel coming in, who, has had a lot of success elsewhere, And people want to present him as being mysterious. They did exactly the same thing with Arsene Wenger when he first came into the Premiership. Oh, mysterious, diet, nutrition. It's very strange, weird. So it's just one of those kind of things, I think, where they're putting it against a kind of dominant cultural narrative and kind of trying to create a story from it.
Yeah. No, that's definitely the feel you get in this article. Sorry, Craig. Yeah.
Sorry, Rob. I do wonder, Stu, like if there's people get drawn into what they can't do.
Yeah.
And what they can do. And there's this dichotomy. And like, I was thinking about this on the drive home today. It's like, certainly from an ecological worldview, I don't want to, ironically, don't want to feel like constrained in my practice of being constantly mindful of what I can and can't do. I just want it to be rooted in something. And then I'm practicing and I'm moving around and I've got something to anchor reflection and practice and gain feedback from others who are in the environment about. But I often wonder if, people get lost in what they can't do, probably because of some of the Twitter discourse. I think it's still pretty common. Like, don't know where questioning sits in an ecological approach. Don't know where instruction sits, as in it doesn't. And I think it's just becomes this like fearful domain because, as you said in your latest YouTube, Rob, it's like it becomes a list of what you can't do anymore if you go there. And I think perhaps a role of us, and it's not saying we're right or wrong, but it's just putting a lens on what it could look like, as you did pretty skillfully on your latest YouTube, Rob.
Yeah, thanks. That's definitely something I was trying to get across on that, Craig. I think, I had the same. This is kind of, I talking about evolution and adapting. I think this is something we talked about, Stu, at the beginning of the year. This I was getting to the point where, you're almost jumping through hoops to prevent someone from giving a direct instruction and telling them not. I'm like, this doesn't feel right. like it doesn't feel with maybe with the strict theory of it, but it doesn't feel with the spirit. Not allowing people to do things doesn't feel with the spirit of ecological approach, right? That's not really what it's about. So I've been thinking about that a lot too. Where do these kind of moments of, jumping in and being direct and stuff fit in? Yeah.
Gone.
Go ahead, Mary.
I'll just round off go on, Marianne, you go.
Sorry.
Again, I was just thinking about there's confusion between various different approaches, and I know that possibly there's some of the sort of let the game be the teacher. It sits in with some of those games, teaching games for understanding and game sense, and the idea that you watch and then you have a reflective discussion afterwards. And that's where the learning happens. So you just kind of let it roll out, and then everyone starts to try and create shared mental models and ideas about what happened afterwards. And maybe there's just a little bit of sort of like bleed between some of those different ideas.
It's not totally wrong, though, is it? In the sense that you're probably looking to make changes to the environment before you're going to utilize a human-to-human, communication medium, or you're going to do it alongside that as well, and you're going to be using it as a means by which to infer or to understand something about the way the athletes are reacting or attuning to what's in the space. So it's not entirely wrong. It's just overly simplified and a little bit too kind of like putting it in a box a little bit, so and that's hard. That nuance is quite hard to convey, isn't it?
No, I'd agree with that, Stu. And I think it comes down for me a lot to, like, I think the biggest difference in my coaching from say 5 years ago to now is probably in language as much as anything. And for that example, Stu, I think we're more likely to frame it. I personally don't believe there is a right and wrong. If I did at one point, it's been proven to not be true many, many times. So I think we're more likely to focus, even if we might go into a funnel of what people may frame as instruction, it's still about exploration. And it's taken into account trajectory and intent, as Rob put the other day. Because I think what's probably pretty clear for me to say, as someone who is coaching a lot every day still, is, if you don't give direct instruction, sometimes when people are in a struggle, it can feel pretty patronizing. And I've experienced that a few years ago. And what that kind of nudged me towards, or guided me towards doing, was actually that as it's important for me to know why I coach the way I coach, really important, if not more important, for the people participating to know why they practice the way they practice. And I think if we can co-create an ecological view, because we're not looking to impose one, because that's probably the antithesis of an ecological view, I would suggest, is if we can co-create it. And as soon as I started to do that, then if I did ask questions to explore or navigate a little bit more, and not against right or wrongs, it was better understood from the athlete's perspective, like they knew the roots, and therefore I was no longer patronizing in their eyes or making them feel stupid. And it was definitely like more of a shared journey from that point. I guess a sense of what Carl would call a wayfinding, like that knowing as we go together, leading out.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think I also like the emphasizing the purpose and like there may be a time when in ecological approach we want to just let people play for half an hour without stepping in at all, right? Maybe there's a time you want to do that, but you do it, why you're doing it, and kind of what's, I think, is a bit different than some of these other approaches. Yeah, I think it is, and we're guilty of, like I said in my video, I think we're as guilty of this as anybody, trying to explain the method by making kind of binary comparisons and looking at single practice activities and saying that's not the ecological approach, this is. I think is kind of led to that a bit. It's totally understandable, and so I think reiterating Stu's point from a few months, all these kind of interpretations, I think, there's logic to them. They're not just complete random errors. Yeah.
Yeah. I think taking time to understand the intention. I see a lot in the media of not that. Like as soon as Tuchel had the tennis balls, it was like, he's using a constraints-led approach. Now, if you were from that view, you could argue that is, but it might be something very, very different in his intention. I was certainly aware when I found constraints, I guess, that I had been probably doing some, or could have explained some of our practice design it was, but it wasn't, because I didn't have it anchored in any intention. So I think you touched on that, Rob, didn't you, in your latest release, in that the methodologies aren't the approach, and therefore it's possible for the same practice to be viewed, but actually it's anchored in very different approaches, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I just actually had a meeting with a bunch of baseball coaches before this, and I suggested something. I can't remember what it was, but they were like, "What? We used to do that 15 years ago. We thought we couldn't do that anymore." And I'm like, no. I'm not surprised you did, because you're smart. You figured it out way before me. It's just we're putting constraint, calling that a constraint, holding a tennis ball, now kind of puts it into a theory and lets you think about where you can go from here. If once you understand what that's specifically trying to achieve and how it fits, what's the next one you can do and how can I add to this? It makes it into a nice framework, I think, rather than giving here's the specific constraints you use in soccer or volleyball or whatever.
I think it's really important to go back to Craig's earlier point as well around co-creation and permissions, and also what the athletes' intention is and what they want. So you kind of get away from it feeling like that the coach is just setting them up to see what happens when they fail and whether they'll learn from it, and watching them struggle because that's better learning or whatever. So I think the context of the whole environment, the whole session, and all of that decision making is really, really important. But it's both. It's the coach and the athletes, and very much around permissions and intentionality with both. And that safe environment then comes into play in there as well.
Yeah, and the last example I wanted to use is, I'll just read this one. This is the one you sent me, you posted, Marianne. It's we actually learned this was written a long time ago, and I think this makes an important point about the connection to methods. So let me just read this paragraph. The fundamental part of manipulating the constraints is ensuring that the learner is developing their own thinking and understanding. With our help, they should be able to anticipate and perceive what they need to do to adapt in order to achieve a task or action when one of the constraints has changed. They should be able to state, if I do X, then Y will happen. They are making the link between the three constraints, and they understand the impact they will have on their performance. When this link is not there, then the performance will break down, right? So we saw that. I was like, oh, that's so the problem with that, of course, is like if X then Y. That's really not fit with. But we since someone told us this was actually written 7 or 8 years ago, because, and I think that makes sense because this is what I would call manipulating conditions. I like to distinguish conditions and constraints. So that's like we've known for years, people have used small-sided games in soccer, but they've been used more for this reason. Let's learn when you should pass and when you should shoot. If X, then Y rules. To me, that's conditions of practice. It's not promoting self-organization. That's what the difference, constraints, right? You're learning, you want them to learn to think and understand. To me, that's the difference here. So it's the same method, can be the same method, but kind of for a different purpose. So this isn't wrong. Like if you use this as an explanation of what we think about the constraints that approach now, I would say that's a very incorrect interpretation. But back when people first started using what we now call constraints, like small-sided games, this is exactly what people were thinking. Yeah.
And I think, Rob, what you said earlier on about how you had coaches saying, oh yeah, we were doing this 15 years ago. That's because they are thinking that when they used conditions in the past, that's the same as constraints, but it's not. And I think the example I would use that's really common is people think either in hockey or football and basically like, oh, we're playing a game and it's 2 touch. Why is it 2 touch? So we get more passing. And people, in theory, have to look up to be able to find passes, we assume. But that just basically says that predefines what actions are possible. It doesn't encourage an individual to explore what information is there to define where I might pass, if I might pass, all these sorts of things. It doesn't do that. So people assume that which is a conditioned game or a condition in a game, which defines and constrains action possibility. But in a constraints-led approach, now, by the way, that condition is a form of constraint, and it's
yes,
one that could be used. I'm not saying it isn't, but so it fits within the broad repertoire. But some people assume that's constraints-led approach. No. A constraints-led approach, if you were to use that model, you'll be doing it for a different reason. So some people thought, well, all I'll do is 2 touch, therefore we'll get loads more passing and people will look up more, right? But then they were often very surprised then that when they took the constraint away, and by the way, players hated it, but when they took the constraint away, that they didn't see this magical load of passing. What they actually saw was players going, oh, I'm free now, I'm going to run with the ball. So it didn't work. It didn't work that way. So what we might suggest is some alternative, or they didn't perhaps get the outcome they were looking for. So that's when they start instructing, pass the ball more. So the alternative is to look at a way in which we might explore when we might pass and what situations we might see that we might pass and when we might not. We might influence or suggest to athletes that there's an advantage to be gained by looking for certain passes or looking for the moment where passes might be of value. I did a recording recently with Andrea Enric for a little mini series I'm producing off the back of his book. And one of the things he talked about is like, there's no intrinsic value to any action in sport, in my sport in particular, in say hockey or cricket. There's no intrinsic value to running. There's no intrinsic value to running with the ball. There's no intrinsic value to passing. The only way there is value is relative to what else is there. Either your opponent or your teammates. That's what gives these things a relative value, and it's understanding the value of those and the how and the when that makes the difference. Now, so I do think that's where some of the misunderstanding stems from with that particular example, is people equating conditions, a form of constraint, with the constraints-led approach.
Yeah.
And I guess it's important to stress the difference.
Yeah, that's why I try to, I know people, maybe gives them a headache when I say, try to distinguish Newell's constraints framework, which can explain all behavior and all, versus the constraints-led approach, right? If I tell you exactly how to move, that is a very restrictive constraint within Newell's model, but that's not the constraints-led approach, right? The constraints-led approach, the purpose is self-organization. That's what distinguishes me, right? You're saying with conditions. Conditions can fit in Newell's model. They're a type of constraint, but they're not the CLA, which is promoting self-organization.
But again, with terms, I wonder, again, Rob, whether constraints-led approach leads, strangely, people to make that assumption. I mean, I have started to use the term affordance-led approach. Now, that's weird because people hate the term affordance. I don't know why. but I actually think that's a better description. What we are actually doing is designing environments that not enable, that's the wrong phrase. We're designing environments that might be rich in information and then working, co-creating and kind of working alongside individuals to begin to understand the ways in which they're perceiving what's in the environment as a means by which to help them with that process of co-adaptive organization, or either with opponents or with each other. And I feel like that's about. I mean, when Danny Newcomb introduced me to the idea of constrain to afford, it was like a game changer. Completely changed my mindset, because up to that point I'd basically been constraining to constraining, probably doing condition games and going around going constraints-led approach, look at me and so that I wonder if, I mean, I don't think we should go around saying affordance-led approach, probably, but I do sometimes. I can so understand why people can't see the distinction.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the constraint term it makes sense, but it does lead to a lot of confusion. Casey, I see where you were wanting to jump in.
Well, no, yeah, I if you'll allow me to play devil's advocate for
definitely,
in the sense that so to go back to that, was it The Independent? Was that what the article was in? And as I understand it, my apologies for not being up to date on periodicals in the UK, but relatively well distributed in media form. Is that fair?
Yeah, good. Yeah.
So here, obviously, some pretty, what I would consider, flagrant misinterpretations by the author of that article. In terms of, I mean, I just imagine what Schulhorn is thinking when they're saying this is differential learning. I imagine he's pulling his hair out. But the fact that there's an article touching on this stuff and putting some of the terminology out into the general discourse around coaching, part of me feels a little bit optimistic about that. And now there's obviously a large group of people like you guys that are going to have to come in and clean up the mess, so to speak. But one of the challenges we run into, at least for me, is that, if this is a viable model, or these are legitimate approaches, where are they? And you it's a little bit of an uphill battle, especially in the United States. I think it's really tough in the United States personally, because for whatever reason, coaching has tended to skew extremely prescriptive and really put the coach at the center of it. But at a minimum, I can go, hey, look, here's this incredibly prominent sporting organization, and they're using these things. Now, they're not represented well in this article, but I was excited to read that, hey, the term differential learning, the idea of constraints, was put out there in the general public discourse at a level that's arguably, I mean, Chelsea versus Tottenham this weekend was probably the second biggest sporting event in the world, only because the Super Bowl was played, right? So I think that to me is it's encouraging. There's some cautious optimism there, and obviously we need to manage the message in a much better way, much clearer. But the fact that it's out there, I can go, hey, read this article, and I'll clean up the mess afterwards. But it is out there, and it's out there at some levels that are very consequential. Is a very inappropriate term, because all levels are consequential. But from a financial standpoint, from a visibility standpoint, arguably the most consequential levels of professional sport, and that to me is a big deal.
That's a good point. I think I'd rather people write about the constraints-led approach or ecological approach and get it wrong than not write about it.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, Casey, because I was thinking before doing this, I was very hesitant to do this. Part of the reason is I don't want to stop people writing blogs and podcasts and people thinking about how they're using it. Like, we keep emphasizing the understanding and applications like an adaptive, evolving. So I don't want people to be afraid of that. We're going to slam them for getting things wrong and things like that too. I think that's an important point. I think people expressing their views on how it works and maybe aren't exactly like the textbook, I think are important for sure.
Is this like this is like a vicarious think aloud, isn't it? What is it that people are attuning to? What are they curious about? What are they noticing in what's being put across? Because that tells us, the affordances that they see in this at the moment, and an opportunity then to, like you say, think about it, do more research, have these conversations, find different ways to explore and communicate.
I'm reminded there, Casey, of I think it's Colin Cronin who gave a session with UK Coaching, I think, Marion, actually, relating to social capital and its influence. And the body coach would be the equivalent here in the UK around his views on what physical education is. And I guess it's that concept of, is there such a thing as bad press, or is any press good because it invokes hopefully a deeper curiosity or some other parties to bring different views, and then people can sense make between them.
And familiarization with just a word and a concept so important, isn't it? And that's why they use implicit advertising for that entirely, that even if you hear something but you don't know what it means, the familiarity means that it's something that you can, because a lot like the language is pretty hard, isn't it? People first hear it and just go, and like you've said, things like using constraint and manipulate doesn't sound really nice.
Yeah. And I guess you could debate, like, on the applied level, the coaching level, how critical it is to worry about getting the details right. For for the research side, especially when there's, we've documented a view that this is nothing new, and it's a lot of, when people mix it like this with things that aren't quite right, it supports that idea. And sometimes, but I think we can take it a little too far with trying to, oh no, you haven't quite got it. But I think that's interesting.
One of the biggest things, I'm slightly reluctant to throw this out there, Rob, because I feel very inadequate at backing it up, and I was hoping Andrew would be on tonight, but hence reading Bickhart, really. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I come across is that the sense that an ecological approach refutes any cognition. And that has really energized me to go and understand, and the conversations with Andrew about, okay, where does memory fit? Where does imagery fit? Where does imagination fit? And I think that's congruent with the issues some people have around this shared mental models in team sports and things like this, of like, how can we plan team interconnections and scenarios and set plays if there is no cognition. So I know that's misinterpretations of Gibson's work, as I'm somewhat finding so far. But I think, touching on that and trying to simplify that as much as possible will open people's minds to be more curious.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Craig. That's another very common one. And when my discussion of what self-organization is and isn't is exactly the kind of thing that feeds into that. There's no thinking, there's no cognition involved, but you were talking about when it's involved is kind of the important point. Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's very true. I think that there's leaps happen, isn't there, between perception and everything else.
Yeah. So no, I think that's a really important one.
I think there's a when and a what as well, isn't there? So the cognition isn't what exactly you're doing with that body part at that moment in time either. So.
Yeah, that's kind of what you're not mentally controlling. Yeah, I find that a challenge too. I had someone on Twitter exchange was asking me, is exploring, looking for a movement solution, a mental skill? And I was like, my initial reaction was no, but it depends what you mean. And we get the same thing too with representation. I had my reaction to, I did an episode on imagery a few weeks ago. I got an interesting reaction to that. You're right. It goes back to what you were saying, Marianne. There's these everyday meanings of these words sometimes that, you can't use them almost. And, you got to redefine them. It's a challenge.
Just making me think there actually that one of the other things that's interesting is this idea that everything has to be external and your focus of attention is always external. And that's, well, there's no hard and fast rules, obviously, but I mean, there's a lot of time that being aware of intrinsic dynamics is really important. And certainly when I'm riding and when I'm paddling, I'm really aware of pressure on seat bones, balance, out of balance, tension in my, because those things, I don't necessarily think about them consciously, but that I'm adjusting to that all the time. That's what keeps me upright. Essentially, as well as that peripheral vision. So my awareness is on those internal dynamics as well. But again, I wouldn't be able to tell you where my body parts are, but I become aware if something goes outside of a boundary, a pattern, like too much tension or too much pressure, perhaps.
It's probably worth mentioning here as well that I feel like quite a lot of some of what we've talked about tonight could be explained by the lens through which people are looking at some of these things. So, for example, if you do have quite an information processing influenced frame at which you're looking at coaching and human performance, then there's a chance that you're going to see some of these alternatives and sort of interpret them in that way. And it's made me think. I had an exchange with a very learned colleague who's very much rooted in the information processing kind of realm. And in all seriousness, well, all right. I mean, it's difficult because this is via text, but when you hear somebody, and a very knowledgeable individual, right? I don't agree that tidal systems and hunting spiders are representative of human behaviors. I think we should take advantage of cognition. And I responded, that's just absurd. I just said, and the conversation didn't last much longer. And the suggestion was that these factors have been propositioned in coach education. And I'm like, what? I honestly said, well, I've never heard of that. I've never, ever heard of that. Now, I can understand why somebody might try and make that link, but I think some of it was driven by the fact that, we actually arrived at an end conclusion, which was this idea that, that the information processing account of human interaction, human performance is clearly a very, very strong lens through which this viewpoint has been created. And therefore, you would look at any other accounts which might, confer in nature that there might be some association with the way organisms are interacting with their environment, and therefore, there might be something that we could take from that. You would obviously just discount that. And I don't think anyone has ever said, oh, hunting spiders, therefore this in coaching. What people might have said is there's some interesting things that we've seen in nature, and do they sort of things apply to a human organism, given that we're essentially a living being. And you, Marianne, talking about working with animals, there's some interesting parallels to be drawn there. But it just made me think about where do some of these ideas or misconceptions come from? And part of it, I think, is it's a misinterpretation that's created by individuals still holding on to essentially information processing accounts of how people act, which can skew the way you would then perceive the constraints-led approach. And I think that's kind of where you were coming from right at the outset when you did the original video, Rob, where you sort of contrasting the two standpoints. Wasn't to say this is right, this is wrong. It's just saying, look, there are some things that just don't kind of interconnect together, and you just need to understand that, So this idea that you can kind of take it, you can intertwine the two things is pretty difficult to unravel. Now, it doesn't mean that, and I wrote this down earlier on, I've heard you say this before as well, Rob, but everything is on the table in an ecological approach, but it doesn't mean it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. And you've said that before, Rob, and it really resonates with me. It's not an all-you-can-eat buffet.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points to it. I agree. I think there's also this kind of, within the research side, at least, this kind of, I don't know if this is the best word, fetishizing the brain, right?
Yeah.
We want a brain to be doing something super complicated, and that's where all skill lies. And you just have to look at animal, like Marianne, like how skillful performers animals are is not really that different than skillful athlete, right? It's I know there, so I can see people's resistance to it. You're right, from their lens, like you were saying, Stuart.
I mean, I'm probably going to get completely shot down for this. Just prepare. But I sometimes find there's a little bit of kind of wanting it to be the brain. There's two aspects in that as well. One of them is that you can kind of then sell somebody something to fix it, a bit of programming, for example. and that's the other bit, is that then you can kind of go, well, there is a little bit of that maybe is a bit easier than the other option, than trying to look outside of that if it's just the brain. And like I said, I've been thinking a lot about things like fatigue and pressure and stuff. And one of the things that I've been noticing recently, particularly with River Tiger, one of my horses, is that her levels of spookiness, arousal, sharpness very much seem to be based on, and she won't be consciously thinking this, but it's like, is the environment safe? Like, it's not windy. We haven't got an event horizon where she can't see stuff. Big tigers could sneak up on her. That her mom's there. That there are things in the environment that would, and Kathy Sierra will probably talk about this being, the central nervous system just downs the slack in the system. So when she's feeling fit and confident and she's rested, her behavior is much more confident. Her action capability changes dramatically. And you will hear people saying, oh, my horse is just being a complete pain today. It's on purpose. I know it's not spooky. It's not scared of those. It was fine yesterday. And it's just like, well, yesterday it probably had another horse around. It was rested. It wasn't windy. There weren't these perceived threats that then downgrade the action capabilities that horse is happy to invest in playing or doing something else. Hopefully I'm making sense here. Now, with a human, that is like, you'll sit down and have a conversation about that being actual decisions that are actually made consciously and cognitively that you can go and, but I think there's a lot more going on. I'm not, obviously we do have cognition and we do have, we do think about things, but then there's whole other stuff going on in like outside of our conscious awareness that is just part of us being a system. So if we want, to perform, there are other bits that are influencing that. Hopefully that makes some sense.
No, I think it does, man. I think it reminds me of some people want us, another common thing I hear people say is the ecological approach is just about coordination, perception, action, right? And it's like Craig was, no, it's, I still want to bring in concepts like cognition, motivation, autonomy, confidence. It's just where those lie in the interaction between the person and the environment, just like everything else.
Yeah. At the moment in time, and those things do dramatically change action capability in a way that isn't. It's not just that's your physical ability, and therefore it should be the same another time. There's all these other things that are affecting it, but they're not necessarily all things that we can consciously be aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or necessary.
Marianne, do you think, just looping back around and running with that, I was coming up with this when you were talking about like feeling and sensing the horse and the weight and under you, and it's very much similar in paddling, and I'm sure it is in various other domains. I get a sense of that due to socio-cultural factors, are we thirsty to extrapolate learning and put it into words and document it and prove it? And I mean, Stu and I have talked about this around it. Like, are words suitable to explain what goes on in perception action coupling, and the difficulty of some of the athletes who just like, I don't know how I do it, but yet they're still thirsty to be able to articulate it to you. And I'm really curious about where that comes from. And when I think about like local or at systemic levels of even how we're asked to do reflective practice or meet targets or KPIs or document learning, it's all like really thirsty to extrapolate things out of a brain or out of a performance and kind of make sense of it and put it on paper and go, okay, that's me, I'm good to have another month's worth of probation or something. I'm beginning to get really curious about that sort of, that's where that thirst to be able to articulate comes from, rather than being comfortable just attuning and showing.
I guess even if we want to attune, meaning still seems to have an awful lot of power and matter to us in terms of learning. But and maybe that's where sort of like things like analogies and storytelling and things come in that I think do sit really well within an ecological approach. And perhaps it is that we've just got used to having something that we can share and measure. And so our language with that sort of mechanistic and industrial revolution type language has then influenced the way in which we think we need to measure and discuss learning.
That's where a lot of the conversation I was having in that text exchange I was talking about on stemmed from, this constant reflection back to sources of education. And, it works here. So that surely that then translates into the physical realm. And I'm like, well, I don't see the support for that. I also think it's partly because we're very used to telling ourselves comforting stories about our amazing capability in the world and how our big brain is what's kind of, like been we're at the top of the food chain. What? Big brain. And we're very good at kind of retrospectively mapping reason onto action. And so it's quite, you can understand it really, can't you? Because like it's subtle, that there's a part of our brain that I think when people talk about cognition, I think what they're talking about is, basically the brain is all powerful and the brain's making it all happen, right? Because that's an appealing proposition. It gives us comfort, that the same aspect of our brain that stops us putting our hand in a fire or walking off a cliff is responsible for our amazing performances. And to then feel like you were saying, well, no, actually, that's just one part of a complex adaptive system that builds into this, and it works in a different way than you probably think. It's not working in to out, it's working flowing both ways. People, I think, go, huh?
Yeah.
I get it, right?
Yeah. No, I totally like linear causality.
Yeah.
Simple time descriptions of time are very comforting, right?
I did that. I want to take credit for that. Until something happens that you don't want to take credit for, and then it was just some crazy happenstance.
The environment. That was a constraint. I'll take it.
Yeah.
We do give up some of that complete individualism, though, don't we? When we recognize that it's a social environment interaction, it's not just us.
Yeah, and it's scary. It's scary, isn't it? That's a scary concept, and it feels. And again, we used the phrase earlier on, like manipulation. I guess some people feel like, oh, it's a little bit manipulative because what you do is you're forcing human beings through the clever manipulation of environments to do things against their will, because of course there's this concept of will, that we are, again, we're rational actors in a context where we're doing this. And then now we start talking about things like consciousness and free will and all those sorts of things, but I don't want to get into that realm. but interestingly, I do think there is there is that, and I think you really touched on something there, Marianne. This idea of, you're essentially suggesting to somebody, you're not quite as smart as you think. You're just going to kind of respond to things that are in the environment in a particular way, and the more you attune to that, then there's an idea that you might become more skillful. What you mean? It's not me? I'm not the person doing it? I'm not having it.
Yeah. No, I think that's common. I've often, on a kind of a slightly different way, I've thought that's partly why people were resistant to the deliberate practice idea. Yeah. What do you mean it's not genes? What do you mean? If I tried as hard as that guy, I would be just as good. Like if I put in as much practice hours, I could have been great too. No, I didn't have the right genes. That's much easier to just accept, right? Than my own failures. Yeah.
I'm a victim of my parents' connections and everything else. That's a much easier association than I'm just lazy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and I think this ties around, one of the things I always have to, accept is that people can do these things if you ask them to. Like an athlete can think aloud. They can tell you what they think they're doing. Like we do this. It's just we don't. The ecological approach kind of downplays that's actually what's happening in the moment and driving but it doesn't deny that people can have metacognition and tell you what they think they're doing. You have to accept that's there still, for sure. Well, it looks like we've gone past an hour, guys. Maybe we'll start to wrap it up there. Hopefully this was, so as I said at the start, I'm hoping maybe we can do this fairly regularly. I don't know how often, but just random conversations, explorations of this. I think this has been very helpful to me. I'm still learning about all of this stuff too, and thinking about it and stuff. So it really helps me just to discuss. Any final thoughts anyone wanted to get out? Or
one thing I just wanted to share that I thought I was thinking about while we were talking about this is, I think there's a really interesting area. And I think going back to what we were talking about earlier on about how I can't remember like mainstream media talking about these ideas. So what we're now beginning to see is individuals in the professional realm professing to utilize some of these ideas openly, which is good, because I think for a long time many of these ideas have become increasingly commonplace in high performance realms, but I think sometimes have been kept secret because not everybody wants everybody else to know, A, they're doing that, and then B, they don't necessarily want to translate it down for fear of, we don't want recreational coaches to be playing with these because this is an advanced thing. And I've definitely heard people talk about that. This is for the advanced realm, so you've got to be an experienced practitioner to embrace this, and which I totally reject. So the fact that it's now become a little bit more commonplace is a good thing. I also welcome, and I reiterate your point earlier, Rob, that I think we should absolutely welcome people writing about it, even if they're not quite getting it right. I think that's a great opportunity for us to be able to sort of explore like this and use those as stimulus points to talk about that. And I definitely don't want to, kind of get people fearful of sharing their thoughts and ideas, and even if they're maybe got the slight intricacies that they've not quite picked up, let's understand that there are a lot of nuances here. I mean, there's sometimes when I hear people saying, "Oh no, that's TGFU. It's not constraint-led approach," and I honestly still now go, "Oh, didn't realize there was a difference," or I didn't realize where the difference was, and I'm like, right, now back to the books. Let's start again. So I think there's some real value in the fact that people are sharing these ideas. Really welcome it. If it's misrepresented, that's a shame. If it's misunderstood, that we can deal with. So, more power to people's elbows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said, Stu. Yeah, definitely. And if anyone wants to reach out and talk about this and join in on us, if you have some ideas, you want to keep expanding on them, we'd love to have you. So, thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.